The Hells Angels biker saw the little girl swept toward a flooded field ditch, and his leap challenged Death's hungry pull. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's story. On a cold, rainy afternoon, the relentless storm seemed to have taken control of the land. The dark sky had been heavy for hours, with clouds swallowing the light and the wind howling through the trees. The small rural town was on the brink of flooding. In the middle of this storm, a little girl was caught in the fury of nature. She had been playing near the fields behind her grandmother's house, unaware of how quickly the floodwaters were rising. The rain had transformed the peaceful creek into a raging force. In an instant, the water pulled her off her feet, sweeping her toward a flooded ditch that ran through the fields. She screamed, her small voice barely audible over the roar of the water. Her heart raced as the current tugged at her, the cold water threatening to pull her under. Her little hands desperately grasped at anything in reach, but it was useless. She was being dragged further and further away from safety. That's when Jake Reaper Morrison, a Hells Angels biker, saw her. He had been riding along the back roads, his motorcycle roaring against the storm. His mind was lost in thought, the thunder in the sky matching the rumble of his engine, when he spotted the tiny figure in the distance. At first, he thought it was just another unfortunate accident caused by the weather. But as he got closer, the truth hit him like a punch to the gut. A little girl, no older than 8, was being swept away by the floodwaters. Without thinking, Jake slammed the brakes on his motorcycle, skidding to a stop in the mud. The roar of the engine died as quickly as it had started, and he threw his bike aside, his leather jacket already soaked through by the rain. His heart pounded as adrenaline kicked in. He knew the risks, the storm was relentless, and the water was dangerous. But there was no time to think, only time to act. Without hesitation, Jake plunged into the rushing water. The cold hit him like a wall, his boots sinking into the mud beneath the surface. The water was rising fast, and the little girl was slipping further away with each passing second. His heart raced as he fought against the current, his massive body slicing through the water like a powerful force of nature. He could see her now, her face pale and full of fear as she struggled to stay afloat. She was too weak to fight the pull of the current on her own. Jake reached out and grabbed her arm, pulling her toward him with all his strength. The moment his fingers closed around her small arm, he felt a surge of relief. But the battle was far from over. The water was fierce, and the ditch was deep. As he pulled the girl toward the shore, he could feel his own strength draining, the cold and exhaustion threatening to take over. But he didn't stop. He couldn't. He had made a promise to himself long ago that he would never let someone down, not again. With a final, desperate lunge, Jake managed to drag the girl to safety, pulling her up onto the bank. She was shivering, her small body trembling with cold, but she was alive. He collapsed next to her, gasping for breath as the rain continued to pour down. The storm raged on, but in that moment, Jake knew he had done the right thing. The little girl, still coughing from the water she had swallowed, looked up at him with wide, terrified eyes. She didn't know who he was, but she knew he had saved her life. In the chaos of the storm, Jake found a brief moment of peace. He had done something good, something that made the world feel a little less cold. But as he looked around, he knew the danger wasn't over. He had saved her, but now he had to get them both out of the storm before it was too late. I'm going to stop this storm, one way or another, Jake thought to himself as he slowly stood up, his legs shaking with exhaustion. The rain kept pouring down, but at least the little girl was safe now. She huddled beside him, still shivering from the cold, but her breathing had steadied. Jake wiped his wet face, the sting of the water mixing with the aches in his muscles. He'd never felt more alive and more broken at the same time. There was something about saving her that had reignited something inside him, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. He looked down at the girl, her small hands clutching her soaked clothes as she looked up at him with a mix of gratitude and fear. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the storm. Jake nodded, the weight of her words settling deep into his chest. He'd saved her, but he couldn't help but feel that this wasn't just about her anymore. It was about him too, a redemption he hadn't been looking for, but one that seemed to find him anyway. "You're safe now," Jake muttered, trying to sound reassuring despite the turmoil swirling inside him. He wasn't used to this, being the one to comfort someone. The biker's life was all about surviving, not comforting, not saving. But the moment he saw her, helpless against the flood, something snapped in him. And now, as they sat there in the pouring rain, he couldn't help but feel that this was only the beginning of something bigger. "What's your name?" Jake asked gently, trying to break the silence. "Emma," she replied, her voice still shaky. "Emma." Jake repeated the name to himself, as if testing it. "You're a tough little thing, you know that?" She looked up at him, a small, hesitant smile forming on her lips. "I thought you were going to leave me behind," she said, her voice full of doubt. Jake felt his stomach twist. "I don't leave people behind," he said, his voice firmer now, more confident than he'd ever felt in years. "Not anymore." He stood up and looked down the flooded field, his mind racing. They were still in danger. The water was rising, and the storm wasn't letting up. He couldn't stay here, not with Emma. He had to get them both to safety, away from the rising floodwaters. "Come on," Jake said, offering his hand to Emma. "We need to get out of here." She hesitated for a moment, but then reached out, taking his hand. She didn't say anything, but her trust was clear in her eyes. Together, they made their way through the flooded field, the rain pouring down harder than ever. The ground was slick, the mud trying to swallow their feet, but Jake kept his grip tight on Emma's hand, guiding her through the storm. They made their way to his motorcycle, which had been left abandoned on the side of the road, its engine still running but sputtering as the rain soaked it. Jake knew they couldn't stay out here much longer. He had to get Emma to shelter, and he had to get her there fast. He looked back at the flooded field, knowing that the storm was only going to get worse. He swung his leg over the bike, signaling for Emma to climb on behind him. She hesitated but then climbed on, wrapping her arms around his waist for support. He could feel her tiny hands gripping him tightly, and despite everything, Jake couldn't help but feel a sense of responsibility. He had to protect her. The bike roared to life as Jake revved the engine, and they sped off into the storm. The rain pelted their faces like needles, but Jake didn't slow down. He couldn't afford to. As they drove through the streets, the world seemed to blur around them, the wind howling, the rain hammering. But for Jake, all that mattered was Emma's safety. As they reached a small shelter at the edge of town, Jake pulled over and stopped the bike. He turned to Emma, his face drenched but his eyes determined. "You're safe now," he said, his voice steady, though his heart was pounding. Emma didn't say anything for a moment, but then she looked up at him and smiled, her wet face lighting up with a glimmer of hope. "Thank you," she whispered again. Jake's chest tightened. He hadn't done this for praise. He hadn't done it for anything other than the fact that someone needed him. And that was something he hadn't felt in a long time. Needed. But as they stood there in the cold, wet shelter, Jake knew that this was just the beginning. Whatever had brought him here, whatever had changed inside him, he couldn't ignore it anymore. He was part of her story now, and she was part of his. And for the first time in a long while, Jake felt like he wasn't alone. The storm outside raged on, but in that moment, he knew they were going to make it through. Together. "I'm just going to keep you safe," Jake said, his voice barely more than a whisper as he turned to look at Emma, still clinging to him as they stood under the shelter. The storm outside raged with no sign of letting up. The sound of heavy rain against the tin roof drowned out almost everything else, but Jake could hear the soft, steady rhythm of Emma's breathing. She was still shivering, though her lips no longer trembled like they had before. They were both drenched from head to toe, but at least they were away from the flooding. They were safe. For now. Jake glanced around the small, dimly lit shelter. It wasn't much, just an old abandoned shed that smelled of must and wet wood, but it offered protection from the elements. The old, cracked windows rattled in the wind, and the bare light bulb hanging from the ceiling flickered intermittently. It wasn't much, but it was enough. He glanced down at the girl again. Her small face was pale in the dim light, but her eyes, those eyes, still had that same look of quiet resilience that had caught his attention when he first pulled her from the flood. She hadn't cried out for help when the water dragged her away. She hadn't begged for anyone to save her. She had just fought, her tiny body fighting the water with every ounce of strength she had. That's what made her different. And that's why, for the first time in a long time, Jake felt that strange, unfamiliar sense of responsibility burning in his chest. He didn't even know why he had stayed. He had seen so many people suffer in his life, but none of them had struck him like she had. The more he thought about it, the more it made sense. He had been running from his past for so long, keeping everyone at arm's length. But now, standing in this cold, damp shed with a little girl who had no one else, he knew he couldn't keep running. "You okay?" Jake asked softly, kneeling down so he was eye level with Emma. She nodded slowly, still clutching the edges of his jacket. She was small, too small to be out here, alone in a storm like this, but her resilience was undeniable. "Thank you," she said, her voice still shaky. It was barely above a whisper, but the sincerity in her words made Jake's chest tighten. He didn't want to hear it. He didn't need the thanks. But it felt good to hear, anyway. "You don't need to thank me," Jake said gruffly. "I didn't do anything special." She looked at him, her eyes filled with that quiet understanding. "You saved my life," she said, her voice small but clear. "You're my hero." Jake looked away, uncomfortable with the words. Hero? He was no hero. He was just a guy who had seen something terrible happen and couldn't just walk away. But hearing Emma say it, the way she said it, made something shift inside him. For the first time in years, Jake felt a glimmer of something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. He shook the thought away and focused on the task at hand. "We need to get you out of here," Jake said, standing up and brushing the wet hair from his face. "It's not safe. We'll find somewhere better." He grabbed his leather jacket from the bench where he had laid it down earlier, wrapping it around Emma's shoulders to give her some warmth. "I'll get us out of here. Just hang on, all right?" Emma nodded. "Okay," she said quietly, her voice almost a whisper. Jake turned to face the open door, the rain still falling relentlessly outside. He didn't know where they were going, but he had to get her somewhere safe. Somewhere away from the storm, away from the dangers of the world that seemed to close in on them at every turn. He had been running from his own problems for too long, but now, he had a reason to fight. For her. "Come on," Jake said, reaching out for Emma's hand. She took it, her small fingers curling around his much larger ones. They stepped out into the rain, the storm's fury still as fierce as ever. Jake could barely see ahead, but he didn't care. He would find a way to keep her safe. He had to. They walked for what felt like hours, their clothes soaked through, the water rising beneath their feet as they made their way through the flooded streets. Jake's mind raced with thoughts of what to do next, but he kept his focus on Emma, making sure she was okay, making sure she was still with him. "We're almost there," Jake said, his voice rough from the exhaustion of the day. Emma didn't say anything, but she squeezed his hand tighter. "Thank you," she whispered again. Jake looked down at her, his heart swelling in his chest. She was right. He had saved her life. But it wasn't just about saving her. It was about saving himself, too. He had been running for so long. But maybe, just maybe, he had finally found something worth fighting for. They reached a small cabin at the edge of town. The lights were on inside, and the smell of wood smoke filled the air. Jake didn't know who lived there, but he had no other choice. They needed shelter, and they needed it now. He knocked on the door, his knuckles numb from the cold. A moment later, the door creaked open, and a woman stood there, her face surprised to see two soaked strangers on her doorstep. "We need help," Jake said, his voice hoarse. "Please, can we come in?" The woman hesitated, then nodded, stepping aside to let them in. Jake could feel the warmth inside as they stepped over the threshold, and for the first time in hours, he felt his muscles relax. The storm might have been raging outside, but inside this small, quiet cabin, Jake knew they were safe. For now, as the storm raged outside, the warmth inside the cabin was a welcome relief. The fire crackled softly in the corner, casting a golden glow on the worn wooden floors. Emma sat on a small couch, wrapped in blankets, her hair still damp from the downpour. She looked at Jake, who was standing near the fireplace, rubbing his hands together to warm them. His face was tired, his eyes distant, but there was something different about him tonight. Something that had changed since they first met. Something deeper than the man who had just saved her life. He wasn't just a biker anymore. He was someone who had a story to tell, someone who had been through the kind of pain and hardship that most people would never understand. And for the first time in years, Jake felt like he wasn't just surviving. He was finally living. But even now, with Emma safe and warm beside him, his mind wandered back to the life he had left behind. The years on the road, the chaos, the endless fights, the brotherhood that had once meant everything to him. It all felt like a distant memory now, something that didn't belong in this small cabin, in this quiet moment. What happens now? Emma's voice broke through his thoughts. She had been sitting quietly, staring into the fire, but now she looked at him with those wide, innocent eyes. Jake hesitated, unsure of what to say. He had been so focused on getting them out of the storm, on getting her to safety, that he hadn't really thought about what would come next. But now, with the danger gone and the storm outside beginning to calm, he realized that they weren't out of the woods yet. They were still on a journey, one that was just beginning. "I don't know," Jake finally admitted, sitting down across from her. His voice was rough, but there was a certain softness to it now, a softness that Emma hadn't heard from him before. "I think we just take it one step at a time." Emma nodded, her small hands clutching the edge of the blanket around her. "I'm not going anywhere," she said quietly. Jake's heart clenched at her words. She didn't know how much those words meant to him, how much they had changed him. For so long, he had been alone. Even when he had been surrounded by his brothers in the club, he had always felt like an outsider. But now, here in this small cabin, with Emma by his side, he felt like maybe he wasn't so alone after all. "Neither am I," he said, his voice steady. He glanced around the cabin, noticing the simple but cozy furnishings. It was nothing like the flashy houses or expensive bars he had been used to in his old life, but it felt like home. The way Emma had curled up on the couch, the way the fire flickered in the corner, the way the room smelled like pine and warmth. It all felt like a fresh start. "You should get some sleep," Jake said after a moment, glancing over at Emma. She had been through a lot today, and she looked exhausted. She nodded, her eyes drooping as she pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders. Jake watched her for a moment before standing up and moving to the small kitchen area. He hadn't eaten in hours, and he could feel his stomach growling with hunger. He rummaged through the cabinets, finding a few cans of soup and some bread. It wasn't much, but it was enough. As he heated up the soup on the stove, his mind kept returning to Emma. She had been through so much in her short life, and yet, she was still strong, still determined. He wondered if she knew how much she had changed him, how much she had made him rethink his entire life. The past few hours had been a whirlwind. First, saving her from the flood, then bringing her to this cabin, finding shelter from the storm. But Jake knew that the real work was just beginning. It wasn't just about getting through the storm anymore. It was about finding a way to live, to really live, without constantly running from the past. He finished heating the soup and set it on the table, grabbing a couple of bowls. He turned back to Emma, who had drifted off to sleep on the couch, her breathing slow and steady. He smiled softly to himself before walking over and gently placing a blanket over her. She had found a kind of peace in this place, and Jake was determined to protect it. He walked back to the kitchen and sat down at the small table, staring into the fire. The storm outside had passed, and the world was quiet now. For the first time in a long time, Jake felt like maybe he could finally stop running. Maybe, just maybe, he had found something worth staying for. He closed his eyes, letting the silence of the cabin surround him. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in years, he wasn't afraid. He was ready to face whatever came next. Together, the morning sun filtered through the small cabin's windows, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. The storm had passed, but the air still carried the cool, damp remnants of the night. Jake sat at the table, a steaming mug of coffee in his hands, staring out the window. His mind was heavy with thoughts of what had happened in the last 24 hours. He had saved Emma from the flood, brought her to safety, and now, they were here, in this quiet little cabin, far from the dangers of the storm. Yet, somehow, he knew that the real storm was just beginning. The past few years of his life had been a blur of violence, running, and survival. The Hells Angels had been his family, his brothers in arms, but the price of that life had been steep. He had lost more than he had ever gained. Now, here he was, looking at a little girl who had somehow managed to crawl under his skin in a way he hadn't expected. Emma was still asleep on the couch, wrapped tightly in a blanket. She looked so peaceful, so innocent, and for the first time in a long time, Jake felt the weight of his past lighten just a little. It was hard to admit, but he knew Emma had changed him. She had forced him to confront the part of him that had been buried for years, the part that wanted something better than the endless cycle of pain and loss. He had always been the strong one, the protector, the one who saved others. But now, for the first time, he was starting to wonder if he could be saved too. He didn't want to think about it too much. The last thing he needed was to get lost in feelings he didn't know how to handle. His past was always lurking, just beneath the surface, ready to pull him back into the darkness. But as he watched Emma sleep, something in him stirred. Maybe, just maybe, he could make a different choice this time. He could stay. He could fight for something better. The sound of footsteps behind him pulled him from his thoughts. Emma was awake, rubbing her eyes and stretching, still looking groggy from the sleep. She yawned and smiled at him, her face brightening. "Good morning," she said, her voice still soft and a little raspy. Jake smiled back, feeling a warmth spread through his chest. "Morning," he replied, setting his coffee mug down on the table. "How'd you sleep?" Emma stretched again, a sleepy little smile on her face. "Better," she said. "Thank you, Jake, for saving me." The words hit him harder than he expected. He had heard them before, but hearing them now, from her, it felt different. He wasn't sure why, but it made something shift. Inside him, he had saved her. He had pulled her from the flood, kept her safe, but in some ways, she had saved him too. The girl had a way of breaking through his walls, of making him see something beyond the chaos of his life. And in that moment, as he watched her, Jake realized that he was starting to want to be more than just a protector. He wanted to be someone who could give her something better than the life he had known. "You're welcome," he said, his voice gruff as he stood up and stretched his sore muscles. "You hungry?" Emma nodded enthusiastically. "Starving," she said with a grin. Jake couldn't help but chuckle. "All right, I'll see what I can find. You stay here and get warm." As he moved to the small kitchen area to prepare something to eat, Jake's thoughts wandered again. What was he going to do next? He didn't have all the answers, but one thing was certain. He couldn't go back to the way things were. He had left that life behind, or at least he had tried to. The road had been all he had known for so long, but now, there was something more to fight for. There was Emma. As he cooked breakfast, Jake felt the weight of the responsibility on his shoulders. It wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about living, about finding a way to move forward. And maybe, just maybe, that was something he could do with Emma by his side. When the food was ready, he set the plates down on the small table, and they sat together, eating in comfortable silence. Emma seemed to be enjoying the simple meal, and Jake was glad for the distraction. It was easy to forget about the outside world when they were together in this little cabin, far from the storm. But even as they ate, Jake knew that they couldn't stay here forever. The world would catch up with them eventually. He had to figure out what to do next, how to make sure Emma was safe, and how to face the demons of his past. "What now?" Emma asked after a while, her voice soft but curious. Jake looked at her, his fork halfway to his mouth. "What do you mean? What happens after all this?" She looked around the cabin, her eyes a little more serious than before. "I don't want to go back to the storm." Jake's heart clenched at her words. "We're not going back to that," he said firmly. "But we have to be careful. We can't stay here forever. We'll figure it out, okay?" Emma nodded, though there was still a hint of uncertainty in her eyes. Jake set his fork down and leaned back in his chair. He didn't have all the answers, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to let anything happen to her. Whatever it took, he would keep her safe. And maybe, just maybe, in the process, he would find a way to keep himself safe too. The days that followed were a strange kind of peace, one that Jake hadn't known in years. The storm had passed, and the skies were clear again, but the storm inside him still raged. He had saved Emma, but she had saved him too. She had made him face something he had been running from for so long. The need to change, to stop living in the past. He found himself thinking about that night by the flood, the way he had acted without thinking, the way he had jumped into danger for a little girl he didn't even know. Maybe that was what it meant to truly live. Stepping up, not because you were supposed to, but because you couldn't live with yourself if you didn't. Jake didn't know how long they could stay in the small cabin. The thought of running again gnawed at him, the pull of the road, the need to keep moving. But this time, it was different. He had a reason to stay. Emma had become more than just someone he had saved. She had become someone he needed to protect. The thought of leaving her, of abandoning her to the world outside, didn't sit right with him. And so they stayed. Days turned into weeks, and Jake began to settle into a routine. He helped Emma with schoolwork when she asked, though he wasn't much of a teacher. He repaired the cabin, fixing what he could with his limited tools, trying to make it a place that could feel like home. Emma spent her days exploring the woods around the cabin, collecting rocks and sticks, as if trying to make sense of her new life in this quiet world. But every time Jake looked at her, he saw the fear beneath her calm demeanor. She had been through so much already. Her family, the flood, everything she had lost. He couldn't forget that. One evening, as the sun dipped low in the sky, Emma came running inside, her face flushed with excitement. "Jake, you have to see this," she exclaimed, grabbing his hand and pulling him outside. He followed her, half smiling at her enthusiasm, and they reached the edge of the small clearing behind the cabin. Emma pointed to the ground, her eyes wide. "Look, a deer. A real one." Jake squinted into the twilight, his heart skipping a beat when he saw the shape of a doe standing just beyond the trees. It was beautiful, its fur glowing in the fading light. He hadn't seen a deer in years, not out here. The woods had always been quiet. The sight of the animal, so calm and unbothered by their presence, made something inside Jake soften. It reminded him of the stillness that had once been a part of his life, before everything became chaos. For a moment, they stood there in silence, watching the deer graze in the grass. Emma's grip on his hand was tight, but he could feel the warmth of her trust in him. "It's amazing," she whispered, as if not wanting to disturb the moment. Jake nodded, his heart full. "Yeah, it is." It was moments like this that reminded him why he had stayed. For her. For the future that he could build with her, away from the noise and the violence of the past. But even as he stood there, the peace was fleeting. In the back of his mind, he knew that trouble was always just around the corner. The world wasn't done with him yet, and he couldn't let his guard down. That night, as they sat around the fire, Jake's thoughts wandered again to the life he had left behind. The Hells Angels were still out there, somewhere. He hadn't heard from anyone in weeks, but he knew that wasn't normal. It was only a matter of time before they came looking for him. He had made his choices, but they had consequences, and Emma didn't deserve to get caught in the middle of it. The cabin had become a sanctuary, but Jake couldn't shake the feeling that it was only temporary. He couldn't protect her from everything, not forever. His mind raced with thoughts of what to do next. Maybe it was time to leave, to go somewhere far away, start over again. But where would they go? How could he keep her safe? And what would happen to him if he faced the past he had been avoiding? The door creaked open behind him, and Emma's small voice pulled him from his thoughts. "Jake, are you okay?" He turned around to see her standing there, holding a piece of paper in her hands. She looked at him with those wide, trusting eyes. "I don't want to go anywhere," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I like it here. With you." Jake's chest tightened. He didn't know how to answer her. All he could do was walk over and kneel down in front of her. He looked into her eyes, trying to read what she needed. "I know, Emma. I know. But we can't stay here forever." She nodded, her small face serious. "I understand." Jake's heart ached. She was growing up too fast. "You're not alone," he said softly. "You never will be." Emma smiled up at him, a smile so full of warmth and trust that it made Jake's resolve stronger. He had to protect her. He had to keep her safe, no matter the cost. But as the fire crackled between them, Jake knew that keeping her safe was going to be harder than he ever imagined. And the hardest part would be facing the demons of his past. He couldn't run forever, but he wouldn't have to face it alone. Not anymore. The days had started to stretch on, and the cabin, once a simple refuge from the storm, now felt like the only home Jake had known in a long time. But even as Emma laughed at something small, a game she had started to play by herself in the corner of the room, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that the peace they had built here was just a fragile illusion. He could feel the pull of his old life, the road calling to him. His mind was constantly racing, trying to come up with a plan, a way to protect Emma and give her a future that didn't involve the kind of chaos he had lived through. There were days when the weight of everything felt too much to bear. The world outside the cabin felt far away, but Jake knew it wasn't gone. The Hells Angels were still out there, somewhere, and they would come looking for him eventually. He had seen it before, the way they worked, the loyalty to the Brotherhood, the way they tracked down those who left. Jake knew they wouldn't let him disappear without consequence. He couldn't afford to ignore it forever. Emma was in the next room now, humming softly as she played with a set of old toys Jake had found in the back of the cabin. The quiet sound of her innocence was a balm to Jake's tired soul, but it only made the reality of the situation more complicated. The storm had passed, but there were other kinds of storms on the horizon. Jake knew he had to prepare for them, even if that meant facing his past head-on. He had promised Emma, that he would protect her at all costs. But protecting her from what? The thought of bringing her back into the world of his past made his stomach twist. He had left that life for a reason, had walked away from the violence and the fear. But now, he wasn't sure if walking away had been enough. What if the past came for them? What if there was no way to run anymore? The sound of the door creaking open brought him out of his thoughts. Emma stood in the doorway, looking at him with those wide, trusting eyes. "Jake?" she said, her voice soft but clear. "Are you okay?" He looked at her, his heart heavy with the weight of his own doubts. "I'm fine, Emma," he said, forcing a smile. "Just thinking." She stepped closer, her small hand reaching out for his. "You're always thinking," she said with a grin. "I think too much," Jake muttered, ruffling her hair. She laughed, her giggle brightening the room. "You don't have to think all the time," she said. "Sometimes it's better not to think too much." Jake chuckled softly, looking down at her. "I'll try to keep that in mind." But deep down, he knew she was right. It wasn't healthy to keep thinking about the past, but it wasn't easy to stop, either. He had spent so long running from it, and now it was catching up with him. Emma tugged at his sleeve, pulling him out of his thoughts. "Do you want to go outside with me?" she asked. "It's nice out." Jake hesitated for a moment. He wanted to say no. He wanted to stay inside, to keep her safe, to not face the world. But he knew that wasn't possible. Not forever. He needed to get out of his head, needed to stop thinking about the storm on the horizon. "Sure," Jake said, standing up and following her out the door. The sun was shining, the air crisp and fresh. The world outside the cabin had come alive again. The trees swayed in the gentle breeze, and birds chirped in the distance. For a brief moment, it felt like everything was going to be okay. But Jake knew better than to believe in the calm before the storm. He knew that the world had a way of shaking things up, of bringing chaos when you least expected it. They walked together through the field behind the cabin, the soft grass tickling their legs as they went. Emma was talking about something she had seen the day before, a butterfly, and Jake found himself listening to her words, lost in her innocence. It was a relief to have moments like this, to have a break from the constant fear of what was to come. But as they reached the edge of the field, something in the distance caught Jake's eye. He didn't want to see it. Didn't want to admit that he had seen something that didn't belong in this peaceful place. But there it was, a motorcycle. A black Harley, parked near the trees at the edge of the woods. Jake froze, his heart hammering in his chest. The bike wasn't just any bike. It was the kind of bike Jake had seen too many times in his past. The kind of bike that marked someone dangerous. Someone who was looking for him. "What is it, Jake?" Emma asked, looking up at him. Her voice pulled him from his thoughts, but the dread in his chest didn't go away. "It's nothing," he said quickly, trying to keep his voice steady. "Let's go back inside." But as they turned to head back, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that their world was about to change. Again, the bike was no coincidence. Someone had found them, and the storm was about to hit once more. As Jake turned his back on the motorcycle, the weight of what was happening settled on him like a thick fog. His heart beat faster, the rhythm of worry and tension pulsing through him. He couldn't ignore the bike anymore. It wasn't just any bike, and the person riding it wasn't someone who had wandered into the wrong neighborhood. It was a message, and Jake knew it was one he couldn't ignore. He glanced down at Emma, still holding his hand, her small fingers gripping him tighter, as if sensing the shift in his demeanor. "Jake?" she asked, her voice small, uncertain. "What's wrong?" Jake squeezed her hand, trying to steady his nerves. "Nothing to worry about," he said, though the words felt hollow as soon as they left his mouth. He knew he was lying to her, and he hated himself for it. The truth was, someone was out there looking for him, and no matter how far he ran, they would eventually find him. The motorcycle was a sign of that, a sign that his past was not just something he could leave behind. It was something that would catch up with him eventually. And when it did, it wouldn't just be him who suffered. Emma had been through enough. She didn't deserve to be dragged into his mess. But he couldn't leave her. Not now. Not when she needed him. Jake turned and started walking back toward the cabin, pulling Emma gently behind him. The warmth of the cabin felt distant now, like a memory that was slipping away with each step. He wasn't sure how much longer he could protect her. The life he had built for them here had always felt fragile, like it could shatter at any moment. And now, with that bike in the distance, it felt like that moment was finally here. "Let's go inside," Jake said, his voice gruff, a little more forceful than he intended. Emma nodded, but she didn't speak again. The silence between them was thick, filled with unspoken fears and the weight of what was to come. When they reached the door, Jake hesitated for a moment before opening it. The warmth from inside the cabin hit him like a wave, but it did nothing to calm the storm brewing in his chest. He closed the door behind them and turned to Emma, who was still looking up at him with those big, trusting eyes. "We're safe here for now," Jake said, even though he wasn't sure if that was true anymore. "But I need you to promise me something." Emma tilted her head, her curiosity piqued. "What?" she asked. Jake knelt down to her level, his face serious. "I need you to stay inside and lock the door if I'm not here, okay? Don't open it for anyone. Not until I come back." Her eyes widened slightly, but she nodded without question. "Okay, Jake." Jake stood up, trying to hide the unease that was creeping up inside him. He had no idea how this was going to play out, but he knew he couldn't let it take Emma down with him. "I'll be back soon," he said, his voice quieter this time, more gentle. He turned and walked out of the cabin, keeping his steps quick but controlled. As he made his way toward the spot where he had seen the motorcycle earlier, his mind raced. Who was out there? What did they want? He couldn't let his past pull Emma into it, no matter what. As Jake walked through the woods, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up, and his instincts kicked in. He wasn't alone. He stopped, his eyes scanning the trees around him, his hand instinctively reaching for the gun tucked beneath his jacket. The sound of a branch snapping behind him made him spin around. "Jake!" A voice called out, low and familiar. His breath caught in his throat. "You're not as hard to find as you think, my old friend." Out of the shadows stepped a man, tall and broad, his leather jacket gleaming in the dim light. Jake's pulse quickened as he recognized the man's face. It was Steele, an old member of the Hells Angels, one of the few who had been loyal to Jake back in the day. But that loyalty had always been based on one thing: brotherhood. And Jake had walked away from that brotherhood, leaving everything behind. Steele wasn't here to say hello or offer any kind of reunion. "You've been running for too long, Jake," Steele continued, his voice rough but tinged with a hint of amusement. "The question is, what do you plan to do now?" Jake took a step back, his hand still on the gun. "You're out of your mind if you think I'm going back with you," Jake said, his voice firm. Steele chuckled darkly, his eyes scanning Jake's face as if weighing him. "I didn't come here for you, Jake. I came here for her." Jake's heart stopped. For a moment, he couldn't breathe. "What do you want with her?" His voice was barely a whisper, but Steele heard it. "She's not just some kid, Jake. She's a pawn, and you've been too blind to see it. They're already watching her." Jake's world tilted, the ground beneath his feet shaking as everything he thought he understood began to unravel. "What are you talking about?" Jake growled, the anger rising in him now, his fists clenching at his sides. "Who's watching her?" Steele's grin widened. "Your past is never far behind, Jake. You can't outrun it, no matter how fast you go. And now, it's coming for her." Jake's blood ran cold. He had tried to protect Emma from everything, but it seemed like the past was going to take everything from him. He was going to lose her too. And this time, there would be no running. Jake's heart raced, and his mind screamed with panic. But then, a flash of resolve cut through. He wasn't going to let her go. Not like this. He had fought too hard to protect her, and he wasn't going to lose her now. Jake's hand tightened around the grip of his gun, his eyes locked on Steele's every movement. The man's words hit him like a truck, and the weight of his past, of the life he had walked away from, slammed into him with force. Emma was in danger, not just from the world he had left behind, but from the very people who had once been his brothers. Steele had always been a reminder of the darkness Jake had tried to escape. But now, standing in front of him, Steele had brought that darkness to his doorstep. "What do you mean? They're watching her?" Jake demanded, his voice low and full of warning. Steele didn't flinch. He only grinned, a sharp, cold smile that Jake knew too well. "You really think you can just walk away from all of this, Jake?" Steele's voice was smooth, like he was savoring every word. "You think You can hide in some cabin with a little girl and pretend the past won't come knocking? Jake felt his pulse race, his mind scrambling for answers. Emma, his Emma, was caught in the crossfire of a world she didn't belong to, a world Jake had hoped he could shield her from. But Steele was right. His past wasn't just something he could run from. It was something that would find him, no matter how hard he tried to bury it. I'm not going back to that life, Jake said, his voice tight. And I'm sure as hell not taking her with me. Steele's laugh was low, almost pitying. You don't get it, do you? You left, but the life didn't leave you. The life doesn't let go. And now, she's part of it, whether you like it or not. Jake's stomach twisted, and his grip on the gun tightened. If you hurt her, I'll kill you, he said, the words slipping out before he could stop them. He knew he meant it. He had made promises to Emma. Promises to protect her, to keep her safe. And he wasn't about to let Steele or anyone else threaten that. Steele's expression didn't change. I'm not here to hurt her, Jake. I'm here to make sure you understand. They're watching her, and they're coming for you. They always do. Jake's chest tightened, his breath quickening. He had known this day would come, but he had hoped it wouldn't. He had hoped that his past could stay buried, that Emma could have the kind of life he could never have. But it wasn't going to be that easy. How do you know? Jake asked, his voice strained, barely above a whisper. How do you know they're coming for us? Steele took a step closer, his eyes gleaming with something darker. Because I'm the one who told them, he said quietly. I'm the one who found you. The words hit Jake like a slap in the face. You sold me out? He asked, the anger rising in him like a wave. Steele shrugged, the grin still on his face. It's not personal, Jake. It's business. You can't run forever. And now, they want you back. They want to bring you in, whether you want it or not. Jake's mind raced. He had been living with the constant fear of his past catching up with him. But this was different. Steele hadn't just found him. He had given Jake's location away. And now, whoever was coming wasn't just the old crew, the ones who had once shared his blood and sweat. This was something worse. This was the end of the line. So what now? Jake asked, his voice low and filled with contempt. Steele's grin faded, and he stepped back, looking Jake over as if weighing his next move. You can leave, he said slowly, his voice dropping. You can run, like you always have. Or you can face it. You can face them. Jake felt the weight of Steele's words settle into his bones. He had never been one to run. But he wasn't stupid. He wasn't going to put Emma in danger for the sake of his own pride. I'm not going anywhere, Jake said, his voice steady. I'm not running again. Steele looked at him for a long moment, then sighed. You know where to find me if you change your mind. But remember, Jake, they'll come for her next. And when they do, you won't be able to protect her. With that, Steele turned and walked away, disappearing into the trees. Jake stood frozen, his mind reeling with everything that had just been said. Emma was in danger. The life he had tried to outrun was catching up with him, and there was no escaping it now. As he walked back toward the cabin, his heart felt heavier with each step. When he reached the door, he paused. He had promised Emma that he would protect her, but now he wasn't sure if that was enough. What if he couldn't protect her from this? What if the people from his past came for her, came for both of them? He opened the door slowly and stepped inside. Emma was sitting on the couch, looking up at him with those wide, trusting eyes. She had no idea what was coming, no idea what he was up against. And Jake couldn't bring himself to tell her the truth. Not yet. Everything okay? She asked, her voice soft, like she could tell something was wrong. Jake swallowed hard, trying to keep the fear from showing in his eyes. Yeah, he said quietly, walking over to her. We're going to be okay. He wasn't sure if he believed it himself, but he couldn't let her see the doubt. Not now. Not when she was depending on him. And with that, Jake sat down beside Emma, trying to push the storm of his past aside. For now, he just needed to focus on keeping her safe. That's all that mattered. Jake stood at the door, his back to the world outside, trying to steady his breathing. Emma's soft voice had brought him back to the present, but the weight of everything still pressed on him, an invisible force he couldn't escape. Steele's words echoed in his mind like a constant drumbeat. They'll come for her next. And when they do, you won't be able to protect her. The storm inside Jake wasn't about the weather anymore. It wasn't about the rain or the wind howling outside. It was about the past he could never fully outrun, the ghosts that had followed him through every decision, every step he had taken since leaving his old life. But what struck him the hardest now was the idea of losing Emma. She had no part in this world. She didn't deserve it. And Jake was beginning to realize that protecting her might mean more than just fighting off his past. It might mean facing it head-on. He turned slowly, his eyes meeting Emma's as she looked up at him, concern etched on her face. "Jake, what's wrong? You've been quiet all night." Her voice was soft, but full of worry, and Jake felt a pang of guilt. He had promised her that she would be safe here, that this would be a place where nothing bad could reach them. But now, everything felt like it was starting to slip away. He couldn't lie to her. Not now. "Emma, listen," he began, his voice low, steady. "There's something I need to tell you. Something about my past, and about what's going to happen next." Her eyes widened slightly, but she didn't interrupt. Jake took a deep breath. "There are people from my old life who are looking for me. They found us." Emma looked at him, her expression unreadable. "Why?" she asked softly, her small voice tinged with confusion. Jake knelt down in front of her, bringing their faces to the same level. "Because of me," he said. "Because I walked away from a life that was dangerous. And now, they're coming for me. And if they find us, they'll try to hurt you to get to me." Emma blinked slowly, her eyes searching his face. "What will we do?" she asked, her voice steady, as if she were already bracing herself for whatever was to come. Jake swallowed hard. "We run." Emma nodded quietly, though she seemed calm, her usual curiosity now replaced with something more serious. "But where will we go?" she asked. Jake's mind raced. He had no plan, no real idea of where they could go to be safe. The world was too small, too connected. No matter where they went, the past would follow them. He couldn't outrun it, not forever. "I don't know yet," he replied, his voice thick. "But we're going to figure it out. Together." He reached out and took her hand, squeezing it gently. "No matter what happens, I will keep you safe." Emma looked at him for a long moment, and then a small smile curled on her lips. "I know you will," she said, her words carrying a quiet strength that Jake hadn't expected. He smiled back, though it felt hollow, the weight of what was coming making it hard to breathe. He wasn't sure if he could protect her from this. The past had a way of catching up with you, no matter how hard you tried to bury it. But what else could he do? He had promised her, and he wouldn't break that promise. "I'll keep you safe," Jake repeated, this time with more conviction. "No matter what happens, we'll get through this." The storm outside had died down, but inside, Jake's mind was still racing, the shadows of the past closing in. He stood up, moving toward the door. "We need to leave," he said, his voice firm. "Now? It's not safe here anymore." Emma looked up at him, her face serious now. "Where will we go?" she asked again, her tone calm but steady. Jake hesitated. "I don't know yet," he repeated, the weight of his uncertainty pressing down on him. "But we'll figure it out." He opened the door, and the cold air hit him, a reminder of how quickly things could change. It was a new kind of storm, one that wasn't going to pass with the rain. Emma stood up and walked toward him, her hand finding his once more. Jake glanced down at her, taking in the gravity of their situation. There was no way out, no easy answer. But there was one thing he knew for sure. He wasn't going to let them take her. Not while he still had a breath left in him. "Let's go," he said, his voice steady. They stepped into the night, the world outside as uncertain and dangerous as the road ahead. Jake had no idea where they were going. But one thing was certain, he wasn't going to run anymore. He wasn't going to let Emma face this alone. The world had been trying to drag him back for too long, but now, with Emma at his side, he knew that whatever happened next, they would face it together. And that was enough. For now, that was all he needed. Jake and Emma walked through the woods in the silence of the night, the moonlight barely breaking through the thick canopy above them. The air was cool and still, a stark contrast to the chaos that had been building inside Jake's mind since Steele's words had hit him. Emma walked beside him, her small hand in his, her steps light and sure. It struck Jake how she seemed to understand the weight of the situation more than anyone should. A child shouldn't have to bear this kind of burden, but here she was, walking through the night with him, not asking questions, just trusting. For a moment, Jake found himself fighting back the overwhelming urge to protect her, to shield her from everything, even from the truth. He had to remind himself that she had already seen more than a child her age should have. The storm might have passed, but the road ahead was far from clear. As they reached the edge of the woods, Jake could feel his pulse quicken. The small cabin they had stayed in was now a distant memory, a place that once felt like safety, but now was just another reminder of what he was running from. He had made a promise to Emma, but as each minute passed, that promise seemed harder and harder to keep. "Where are we going?" Emma's voice broke the silence, soft but filled with curiosity. Jake hesitated for a moment, trying to figure out the right words. "We're going to keep moving," he said finally, his voice steady despite the unease swirling inside him. "We can't stay in one place for too long. It's not safe." Emma nodded, her face serious but understanding. She had already figured out that the world wasn't as simple as it seemed. She had seen the way Jake tensed when Steele had appeared, the way the man's words had rattled him. She knew they were running, and she knew they couldn't stop. "Are you scared?" Emma asked quietly, her eyes searching Jake's face. The question caught him off guard. He had never really thought about fear in the way she had asked. He had always pushed fear aside, buried it beneath the weight of his decisions. But now, standing there with her, the truth was undeniable. "Yeah," he said slowly, meeting her gaze. "I'm scared, but not for the reasons you might think." Emma looked at him, her eyes wide, but she didn't say anything more. She just kept walking beside him, her small hand still in his. For a moment, they walked in silence again, the weight of the unspoken between them hanging in the air. Jake's mind raced, his thoughts spinning. He wasn't sure where they were going, but he knew they couldn't keep running. There had to be a place where they could be safe, where Emma could grow up without the constant fear of the past catching up with them. He had to find that place. For her. He had promised her. The sound of a vehicle engine in the distance made him freeze, his body going tense as his instincts kicked in. Emma looked up at him, sensing the change in him, her small body pressing closer to his. He held up a hand, signaling for her to stay still, and listened intently. The sound grew louder, and Jake realized it wasn't just one vehicle. It was a convoy, more than one engine humming in the distance. Panic surged in him. It was too close. They were too close. "We need to move," Jake whispered urgently, pulling Emma along as he turned back into the woods, away from the road. His heart was pounding now, adrenaline surging through his veins. He had no idea who was out there, but he knew it wasn't good. He couldn't let them find him. Not now. Not when Emma was with him. As they pushed deeper into the forest, the sounds of the vehicles faded behind them, but Jake didn't slow down. He kept moving, his steps quick. And sure, his grip on Emma's hand tightening. She didn't say anything, but he could feel the tension in her body, the way she mirrored his urgency. They had to get away. They had to stay ahead. Jake's mind was racing. He needed a plan. He needed somewhere to go. But his thoughts were interrupted by a rustling sound ahead of them, and Jake immediately dropped to a crouch, pulling Emma down beside him. The rustling grew louder, and then, emerging from the darkness, a figure appeared. Jake's heart skipped a beat, but as the figure came closer, he realized it wasn't one of the men from the convoy. It was just another person, but someone who clearly had no idea who they were. The figure was tall, with a rugged, weathered face. He carried a rifle slung over his shoulder, his movements cautious, but there was no immediate threat. Jake held his breath, waiting for the man to pass by, but just as he thought it was safe, the man stopped, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the forest around him. For a moment, Jake felt the weight of being caught. But then, the man's eyes landed on them. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice rough but not threatening. Jake's mind raced. He couldn't afford to reveal himself, couldn't risk drawing attention. But before he could make a decision, the man spoke again, his tone softer this time. "You don't look like trouble," he said, his gaze moving to Emma, his face softening. "You lost." Jake didn't trust him, not for a second. But something in the man's voice made him pause. "We're just passing through," Jake said, keeping his voice steady. "Looking for somewhere safe." The man studied him for a moment, his eyes flicking from Jake to Emma. "Safe?" he repeated, then nodded slowly. "This is a rough place to be, especially for someone like you." Jake tensed, but the man didn't seem hostile. "I don't know who's chasing you, but it's not safe out here." The man continued, his voice dropping. "There's a cabin not far from here. It's abandoned, but you might want to stay there until the storm blows over." Jake didn't know what to think. Was the man offering help, or was this a trap? But the desperation in his own chest told him to take the risk. "Where?" he asked, his voice cautious. The man gave him directions, and with a final, lingering look, he turned and disappeared into the woods. Jake watched him go, his mind still racing. Was this a stroke of luck, Or was it just another dangerous game being played? Either way, they had no choice but to follow his lead. They had to keep moving. They had to survive. Jake and Emma moved cautiously through the woods, the night air still damp from the remnants of the storm, their footsteps muffled by the thick blanket of fallen leaves and damp earth. The man's directions had been clear, but the forest around them felt unfamiliar and threatening. Every crack of a twig, every rustle of the wind through the branches made Jake's muscles tense, his eyes scanning the shadows, waiting for the next danger to reveal itself. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Emma walked beside him, her small hand still gripping his, but Jake could feel the weight of the silence between them. She hadn't asked any questions about the man they had encountered, and Jake was thankful for that. He wasn't sure how to explain it all to her. How could he explain the danger they were in? How could he make her understand why they had to keep moving? Why there was no place for them to rest? No place for them to truly be safe? The cabin was just ahead, or so the man had said, though Jake didn't fully trust the stranger's words. Still, they had no other choice. He had no other plan. The cabin was their only option for shelter, at least for the night. He could hear the sound of the wind shifting through the trees, and as they reached the edge of the woods, the faint outline of the cabin came into view. It was old, the roof sagging in places, and the windows were dark, no signs of life. It looked abandoned, just as the man had said. Jake stopped just short of the front door, scanning the area around them. He didn't like how exposed they were. If someone was watching, this was the perfect spot for an ambush. But then again, the risk of being out in the open was just as dangerous as being trapped inside. He had no choice but to move forward. "Stay close," Jake murmured to Emma, his voice low. She nodded, her face serious, her eyes wide as she took in the cabin. She knew the danger as much as he did, though her understanding of it was different. For her, this was just another step in the strange journey they had found themselves on. Jake pushed open the cabin door slowly, the hinges creaking in protest. The interior was dark, the air thick with dust, and the musty smell of a building left unused for too long. They stepped inside, the floorboards groaning under their weight as Jake led Emma further into the room. The dim light from outside barely filtered through the cracks in the walls, casting long shadows across the wooden floors. It was empty, but Jake didn't trust the silence. It was too still, too quiet. He moved to the far corner of the room and set down the small bag he had carried with them. His eyes scanned the space quickly, looking for any signs of trouble. The room was bare except for a few old chairs and a table that had seen better days. The remnants of a fire pit sat cold in the center of the room, and the walls, once sturdy, were now covered in peeling paint and grime. It was hardly a home, but it was shelter. "For now, we'll stay here for the night," Jake said, more to himself than to Emma. "Tomorrow, we keep moving." Emma didn't respond immediately. She sat on the floor, pulling her knees to her chest and wrapping her arms around them. Jake could see the exhaustion in her face. She had been through so much, more than a child should ever have to endure. And he had failed her. He had promised to protect her, and now here they were, hiding in some forgotten cabin in the woods, with nowhere else to go. He had no answers for her, no solutions. Only the promise that he would keep her safe for as long as he could. The wind outside howled again, louder this time, and Jake glanced toward the window. He had a feeling that it wasn't just the storm that was making him uneasy. The world outside had a way of creeping in, of making itself known. "Jake!" Emma's voice broke through his thoughts. He turned to look at her. She was watching him, her small face filled with an uncertainty that made his heart ache. "Are we going to be okay?" she asked, her voice so soft, so fragile. Jake's chest tightened. He didn't have an answer for her. Not really. He couldn't promise her that everything would be fine. He couldn't lie to her, not now. But he could promise her one thing. "I'm going to do everything I can to make sure you're safe," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'll protect you, Emma, no matter what." She nodded, but Jake could see the doubt in her eyes. She didn't know if she could believe him, and he couldn't blame her. The world had already shown her too many broken promises. Jake stood up, walking to the door and closing it behind him. The night was quiet, the kind of quiet that felt like it was holding its breath. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, that the world was about to catch up with them, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. He wasn't sure how long they could keep running, how long they could keep hiding in places like this. But for now, this cabin would have to be enough. He would keep Emma safe, even if it meant running from his past forever. And when the storm finally broke, he would face it, no matter the cost. He just needed to keep her safe until then. Jake turned back to Emma, her small figure framed by the shadows in the corner. He walked over to her, sitting down beside her on the cold, hard floor. She didn't say anything, but she leaned into him, her small body seeking comfort in his presence. For a moment, everything else faded away. There was no past, no future, just this moment. And in that moment, Jake made a silent promise. He would protect her, no matter what. Days passed in the cabin, and the world outside remained a silent, threatening presence. Jake spent every moment thinking about their next move. The forest outside felt less like a sanctuary and more like a trap with each passing day. Steele's warning about the past catching up to them hung over him like a dark cloud, and the unease gnawed at him constantly. Emma, however, had adapted to the situation with an ease Jake had not expected. She spent her days drawing, her small hands filling page after page with pictures of animals, trees, and even strange creatures that seemed to reflect her attempt to make sense of their world. Every so often, she would ask questions about the storm, about what happened before they came here, but Jake always answered with the same gentle promise. We're safe here for now. It was a promise that felt more fragile each day. One evening, as the sun set behind the trees and the temperature began to dip, Jake stood by the window, staring out into the darkness. He knew they couldn't stay here forever. Steele had been right about one thing. The past was never far behind. Jake had always known that. He had hoped it would stay in the past, but now, it was clear. The people from his old life were coming for him, and he couldn't keep Emma safe if they were caught in the crossfire. The door creaked open, and Emma walked into the room, her face flushed from the cool air outside. She looked up at Jake, sensing something was different about him. "Jake?" she asked, her voice tentative. He turned to face her, forcing a smile, but she could see the weight in his eyes. "What is it?" she asked softly, walking over to him. Jake sighed, his heart heavy. "It's time," he said quietly. "We need to go. The people I've been running from are getting closer." Emma blinked, her brow furrowing. "But, where will we go?" Jake crouched down to her level, taking her small hands in his. "We'll figure it out," he said, though he wasn't sure how. "We always do. But we can't stay here anymore. It's not safe." She didn't argue, just nodded, a maturity in her eyes that Jake had never expected from someone so young. "I understand," she whispered. The decision weighed heavily on him. There had to be a place where they could start over, a place where Emma could have a future. But every place seemed just as dangerous as the last, and Jake couldn't bear the thought of leading her into more danger. "I'll protect you, Emma," he said firmly, his voice steady despite the fear creeping into his chest. "No matter what." Emma smiled up at him, her small hand reaching up to touch his cheek. "I know," she said softly. "I trust you." That trust was all Jake had left. It was everything. The next morning, they packed what little they had and left the cabin behind. Jake's heart clenched as he glanced back one last time. The familiar sight of the small building, now a symbol of everything they had been forced to leave behind. They moved quickly, quietly, staying off the main paths, staying hidden in the shadows of the trees. The further they got, the more Jake's mind raced. The storm had passed, but the real storm was just beginning. He could feel it in his bones, the weight of the danger that was following them. Every shadow, every creak of a branch underfoot felt like a threat. They had to keep moving. There was no other option. As they walked, Emma stayed close to him, her hand in his, her steps sure but soft, the sound of her breath in the stillness the only noise in the air. They didn't speak much. There was no need for words. They both knew what was coming. They could feel the pressure building around them, the world growing smaller with every step. After what felt like hours, they finally reached a small clearing in the woods. The silence around them was oppressive, the only sound the wind rustling through the leaves. Jake stopped and scanned the area, his instincts on high alert. Emma squeezed his hand and looked up at him, her eyes wide. "What's wrong?" she whispered. Jake didn't respond immediately. He was trying to decide whether to trust the feeling that had settled in his chest, the feeling that someone was watching them. His heart raced as the sound of footsteps broke the silence. He spun around, his body tensing, but there was no one there. Only the shadows of the trees, stretching long and ominous. "Jake!" Emma's voice was barely a whisper. She could feel the tension in him. Stay close, he said, his voice low, as he pulled her behind him. The footsteps grew louder, then stopped. Jake's hand instinctively went to the gun at his side, but he didn't draw it yet. Whoever it was, they hadn't revealed themselves fully. Show yourself, Jake called out, his voice firm, the fear in his chest rising. A figure stepped out from behind a tree, tall and lean, his face obscured by the shadow of his hood. Jake's heart skipped a beat. You're not from the club, Jake said, his voice low but steady. The figure didn't speak, just tilted his head as if sizing Jake up. Finally, he spoke. I'm not here for trouble, he said, his voice rough, but not unfriendly. But I know who you are, Jake. And I know what you've been running from. Jake's blood ran cold. How did this stranger know his name? How did he know what was coming? The figure stepped closer, lowering his hood to reveal a face Jake instantly recognized. It was a face from his past, someone he had hoped to never see again. I'm here to help, the man said. But if you want to survive, you need to come with me. Now. The words hit Jake like a punch to the stomach. He had hoped, prayed, that there was a way out, that they could escape this nightmare. But now, with Emma standing beside him, with this man offering help, Jake had to make a choice. Stay hidden, keep running, or face the past. The choice was clear. They had no time to waste. He had to face it. For her. For them. Let's go, Jake said, his voice filled with determination. We don't have much time. Emma looked up at him, trusting him completely. And together, they took the first step into the unknown, the storm no longer in the sky, but looming on the horizon. They were about to face whatever came next. Together.